everyone is coming on, but we are recorded. So hello again to the recorded folks. I'm Chris Kosakowski, and I'm going through our DVSA 101 for today. I do want to give a heads up that I'm just getting over COVID, so I do have a bit of the brain fog still. So if I'm very confused or confusing, sorry. But today, we're just going to go through a little bit of why we're here, an overview of DVSA, which I should probably clarify is domestic violence and sexual assault. Familiar with the acronym. How to implement this a little bit, and then we'll close out at the end. Is it still hard to hear? I don't know why it's not picking me up in terms of volume. Is it still really hard to hear? Or is this better? It's better? Okay. I'll try to be loud. So we're just kind of going to get into it. If you've not been with me for a presentation before, you know I don't just talk at you all. I want this to be a little bit more of a conversation because all of your knowledge and input is also very valuable. So the first question that I kind of want to dive in a little bit for us all in the why we are here today to talk through this stuff. And if you could answer the question for me, given your role, so either your role as a board or foundation member or role in the community in general, why is it important that we're having this conversation of breaking down kind of the basics of domestic and sexual violence? So again, given your role, why is it important we're having this conversation?
Want us to just jump in?
Yeah. Remember when those days were happening?
Yes, I just responded in the chat. My name is Megan Dean. I'm with the foundation, and I'm an attorney outside of my work with Vera House. And I think it's really important. I think that we all joined Vera House in whatever capacity that we did because we have the same goals and the same mission. And I don't want to speak for everybody, but advocating for victims of domestic violence is something that's always been a part of what I've done as my job, in the legal world, whether that be my work or on a pro bono basis. And I think that sometimes we're focused on what we do in terms of fundraising efforts and other things. And it's really helpful, I think, to refocus on the mission and the core values of the agency. And it's something that I think we all share about and we're passionate about. So I think this is really helpful for us to sort of, not only, to refocus on that, but to get sort of back to the basics, I guess. It's really simplified, but I appreciate this.
That being able to focus on the mission and that core kind of anchor of why we're here and what we understand, using that to help for how you're then doing some of that fundraising and how you're pitching and selling some of this stuff, for lack of better words, to other community members as well is incredibly important. Definitely. Other folks, given your role, why is it important that we're having this conversation about an overview of domestic and sexual violence?
And I can speak up. So Rebecca Ortiz, I'm a board member, and I think it's important to have this conversation on an ongoing basis, because I think sometimes I know a lot about domestic violence and sexual assault at this point because I've been involved with the organization for a while. Some of my research focuses around this, but I think it's important. The reason that I attended is to not get lost in what I think I know, and I need a reminder, or I need constant re-education, or just making sure that I really am staying clear in what we're doing. So it's a reorientation, if you will, of why we're here and what are the important factors. Because I think we can start to forget about the things that we know. And so it's good to remind ourselves.
Yeah, so one kind of that refresher and maybe a regrounding in some of the stuff that you may already know. And I've been doing this work for almost over a decade now, actually. But still, there are things that I'm learning and that are new terms, new concepts, reframing of some of those things. That's an ongoing learning process. That's really important, definitely. Maybe one more other person, if you want to share, given your role, why it's important that we're having this conversation today about just this overview of DVSA.
Hey, Chris, Benita, I just wanted to introduce that Fran's on the call. She's our new development and executive assistant here. And she will be working also with the board and trustee members. And so I'm excited for her to be here and hear from some of you. There she goes.
And if folks don't have an answer to that right now, that's totally fine. You can always throw it in the chat, but I want you to, I start with this also to kind of help you all kind of ground yourself. And as we're going through this content, to always remember the application of it, right? Like how can you take, you know, any of the what we're talking about today and put it into action? Because that's really what the ask is. You know, as board and foundation members, you are also crucial to our mission and how we are moving forward as an agency for the community, as kind of that guiding force for, you know, some of those big picture decisions that are being made, the financial stability of the agency. All that is incredibly important for our survival, and then subsequently how we can then serve clients. So thinking about, yes, it's important that you know the definitions and the stats and things like that, but then how can you put that into practice in your own personal lives and in your work here on the board and foundation to better help us move forward for our community? If you don't know, you should know these, but this is our vision and our mission. Our vision is a world free of abuse or violence and abuse, I'm sorry. And our mission is to prevent, respond to, and partner to end domestic and sexual violence and other forms of abuse. I go through this as obviously as Board and Foundation. I'm hoping that you are already aware of our vision and mission, but also to just again re-highlight that in this, it says violence and abuse. And it's really talking about all forms of violence and abuse, right? That yes, the domestic and sexual violence aspects are core to that, but there are so many other forms of harm and oppression that exist in our culture and our society that connect to that. And you know, obviously, if you are here, you know that these are key aspects of our work. But just as that reminder that yes, today we'll be talking a little bit about two specific forms of that, but there are so many other things that are connected and that impact the lives of folks that we're hoping to serve. Definitely. And again, you should hopefully all be a bit aware of all of the services that we offer as an agency. These are our what I call the kind of core four. Are you able to see that? The things, okay. I have the chat up and I never know, like, do you want to see like a black box where I have the chat? But again, our kind of like core four services are our clinical, advocacy, shelter, and education teams that obviously have separate kind of focus areas and branches off of those and other things that we are providing as services. But our clinical therapy services for folks who've experienced sexual assault, our advocacy services for folks in the community who need assistance with kind of navigating systems and getting that support, our shelter for folks to have that safe place to go for a short amount of time to, you know, escape in a unsafe situation, and our education team being out in the community to raise awareness and provide that prevention messaging are kind of the cornerstones of our work here. And it's important that you all have a level of familiarity with kind of the inner workings of those programs. If you have any questions kind of about what some of that stuff looks like or what that like actually looks like on the day-to-day for some of us, please always reach out to some of the folks, myself included, if you are wanting to know a little bit more or have any thoughts about those services. That's incredibly important as board members and foundation members that you have that level of familiarity. And obviously, you know that we have our 24-hour crisis line and our web chat service too, so folks can access those things. Yeah. So let's dive in a little bit about the content that we're going to talk about today with domestic and sexual violence. And I have another prompted question for you all, which is a little more theoretical in nature. So it is designed to be a bit of a thinker. But I'm hoping folks can share with me either out loud or in the chat or whatever. How do you form your understanding of domestic and sexual violence. So again, how, as an individual, you know, we have all of these different ways that we learn about things, how we understand things, how we conceptualize things. And I'm curious for you all as board and foundation members, how you are understanding domestic and sexual violence. Not necessarily in the definition sense, but maybe how you came to learn about it, how you contextualize it, where your framework comes from.
I'm happy to jump in again. I guess I'm an attorney, and when I was in law school, I joined an organization called the Courtroom Advocates Project that asks for volunteers to represent victims of domestic violence seeking civil orders of protection in family court. So normally when you go to family court and you're first seeking a civil order of protection, you're not represented by an attorney. You don't need an attorney there. But it's it's an ex parte application, and a lot of the victims are very scared. They don't know the process. And so it was asking for volunteers who were law students to assist barred attorneys in that process. And I really, I thought I knew what I needed to know about domestic violence before starting that. And I learned very quickly I knew nothing about it. There are several clients that I represented with barred attorneys who appeared for the first appearance and then never showed up for the final order, never served it on their abuser. And I couldn't wrap my head around sort of why that was happening. And I was like, I don't understand, just serve it. What's the problem? And I don't. And then there are a couple of times where I distinctly remember, which is actually why I became more involved in this type of work afterward, was a particularly very young girl with a very young child. And she was physically abused on a number of occasions. She came and appeared very, very, very abused to court. It was very obvious that a recent event had happened, and I called her to remind her of her second appearance, and I could hear her abuser in the background, and she let me know that they were back together and she no longer needed an order. And I was just crushed, and I wanted to go drive to her house and remove her myself from the situation. And, I underwent a lot of training afterward where I learned, the sort of more of the cycle of domestic violence, and that it's not such an easy black and white thing. And, it was really a learning experience for me, but that's sort of where, not to say I thought I knew it all, but it really was sort of an eye-opening experience. So that's sort of where, my framework, I guess, sort of came from. I underwent a lot of training through law school, and then I ended up working for legal aid, specifically in their family court DV unit after law school. So, it's sort of with a legal arm is where my framework came from, but it came with a lot of training and working with support groups for victims. So
if I can kind of summarize a little bit and tell me if this is kind of incorrect to your experience, that it sounds like kind of in the beginning the framework of how you're understanding it kind of, one, comes from a legal perspective, and two, was kind of taught to you kind of more academically, and then kind of going through this experience of actually doing the work, you were able to develop a more empathic understanding and a more kind of nuanced contextual understanding through working with survivors and victims.
right.
Yeah. And there's a piece in kind of your sharing that I also I'm going to put a pin in and we'll circle back to then once you kind of do know kind of what this stuff looks like, and also are knowing individuals who are experiencing it, that desire to then fix it kind of comes up for a lot of folks that we're going to revisit kind of that thought a little bit later. So thank you for providing that as an example. I'm going to circle back to it if that's cool.
Sure. I apologize if I was supposed to respond in the chat, as if there are people responding.
People are doing everything they're supposed to be doing, so I appreciate it. In the chat, and then if other folks want to chime in, that's totally cool. So Rebecca shared, as a woman feeling that you had to be trained to be fearful of these things happening, that you have this learned kind of socialization around domestic and sexual violence that is gender specific and has some layers there, that this is a learned thing that you understand it as, I have to protect myself from this thing happening. Does that sound what you're saying, Rebecca?
Yeah, and I would also add in that I think it kind of piggybacks a little bit on Megan, is sort of some of the assumptions that you grow up with, which is that you should be fearful of particular types of men. And sometimes that has to do with race or class or anything like that. And that rape only happens, or sexual violence and domestic violence only happens in certain ways. So a lot of the stereotypes are also things that you learn.
Yeah, and that, part of how we understand these concepts are also then from our families, from our relationships, from, growing up, that's how we're kind of learning some of those things that we sometimes have to unlearn when there are those harmful then stereotypes and biases that are layered into that as well. So there's a lot of misconceptions that come with that as well. I'm not sure why the volume is continuing to be an issue, it seems like, for some folks. I apologize. This is also not my office, so I don't have like all of my things to then fix it. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna try and steal these headphones. That might help.
And is that any better for folks? Yes. Okay. I don't know why that was going on. I apologize, and hopefully you got the gist of what I was saying. But just keep going. I'm going to just keep running through the chat real quick. That how we understand domestic and sexual violence. Jody shared kind of some of those content pieces around that there are different forms of violence. Kind of maybe that power and control is a layer that's in there for individuals. Tim shared that from your experience examining the continuums of identity and relationship development and interdependencies of individuals and groups, and wow, lots of things. Dependencies, codependency, and collusion. So maybe some of those pieces of how this shows up in relationships and how that differs for folks, depending on some of those things, and maybe some of the other factors that contribute as well. So yeah, with this, again, I kind of do this to kind of have us think about where we're learning this stuff from, and how this kind of shows up in our lives. That there, I can, and we will go through, I'm going to skip an activity for time's sake, and go kind of right into these key concepts of how we're defining these issues, how they are on paper. But then there is kind of the what the book says, and then there's the reality piece of it, right? That, if we're looking at, and we're just going to start looking at some of the definitions for some of these issues, right? We can understand that domestic violence can be defined as a pattern of abusive or assaultive behaviors, which can include physical, sexual, and psychological attacks or behaviors, as well as some of the economic coercion that folks face that a person is using against their intimate partner. So with this definition of domestic violence, it's really looking at what behaviors are happening in a pattern within a relationship. So an individual behavior is just that, it's just a behavior, but it's really looking at what is the context around it that makes the difference, right? So I can sit here and say, someone punched me in the face. That is an assaultive behavior in and of itself. Does that mean I'm in a domestic violence relationship? Maybe, maybe not. There's context that matters that helps to define that. If we're just looking at these things as how they are on paper without the context of society, of culture, of, my individual experience, we're not getting the full picture here. When we're looking at the definition of sexual violence, we're looking at any sexual act, or really any act that is perpetrated against someone's will. So they did not allow this to happen. It can encompass a lot of different behaviors, but all of which involve individuals who do not consent or are unable to consent or refuse allow that action to happen. So it is any sexualized behavior that a person did not say, I would love for this to happen. This sounds really great to me. I am okay with this happening. There is not consent present. So this can be, we'll talk through some examples in a little bit, so I won't spoiler alert some of that stuff. And then when we're looking at the definition of stalking, it is the action of willfully and repeatedly following or harassing another person in circumstances that would cause a reasonable person to fear injury or death, especially because of expressed or implied threats. So again, a person choosing to do behaviors that are intended to cause fear or harm. They're not just happen to be there. They are making a choice to show up at a person's work, follow them to their car, with the intent of creating an emotional impact. When we're looking at, again, that context, if I'm sending someone a teddy bear on their doorstep, that's a nice thing. Everyone likes a teddy bear, I'm sure. Some people don't, and they're cold, but that's fine. But when it is a repeated pattern, when it is known that this will cause a desired emotional reaction from that person, that is where then stalking comes into play. And obviously there are a lot more nuances to some of these things. This is just a basic overview of some definitions to kind of get us started. Are there any things, obviously I highlighted some of the terms or here in red, but are there anything that kind of stands out from these definitions for folks other than what's highlighted there? And if not, that's okay. Because we're gonna move into looking at I think Jody had mentioned that there are different forms of violence that exist. And I want to walk us through a little bit of an activity to kind of look at and talk about some of those different forms or types of abuse. So the first question I have for you is, if we were to take abuse and kind of put those into 4 main categories, what would those 4 categories be? And you can say it out loud or in the chat. So we got verbal as one of them, correct? Thanks, James. Emotional being the second. And then physical and psychological. So psychological, I kind of lump emotional and mental into that. Those are the 4 main ones that we're going to talk about. Benita shared financial as another one. And this is kind of where then context makes some sense, and also where the importance of language and also the, in my opinion, unimportance of differentiation for certain things kind of comes up. That yes, exactly to your point. So the financial sometimes is listed as its own type of abuse, and some people kind of pull out, I am going to call my relationship narcissistic abusive relationship, right? That some people have language for their own personal experiences, and I'm never going to correct a person who's talking about their experience and like, no, you're not actually facing this, you're facing this. But when we're looking kind of the nuance of that, yes, the financial piece, because that usually stems from, it's not that like, I just love the money so much, more from the, I love to control my partner so much. That's where it might fit into that psychological or emotional category, like you said, Benita, definitely. But so we've labeled kind of these 4 main categories, and I just want to take a minute for us to kind of break down each of those categories. So I'm going to ask for folks to share again, either in the chat or out loud, and we'll go kind of category by category, starting with verbal. What are some examples of behaviors that might fall into a verbal category of abuse? So things like name calling, insults, belittling, and Jody, thank you for adding things like tone, right? So it's maybe not the words that are being used, but how they're being used, right? How the tone that is kind of put there, the volume. So shouting at a person, the specific language that's being used, all of that's going to fall into that verbal category, right? That with verbal, it's important to kind of sorry, brain fog. Hold on one second. Think about the pieces that are going on in those behaviors that are causing that emotional impact as well, right? So it's not just that, I called you fat. It is that, I know that that is going to be hurtful to you, and that is going to make you feel a certain way in the way that I'm saying it. It's when we're looking at verbal abuse that is also kind of sexual as well. It's kind of the difference also when we're talking about tone between, you know, hey, I like your outfit, and hey, I like your outfit, right? That sorry about that. That was weird to have to listen to, right? That tone makes a huge difference, right? And you can see that in a lot of different ways. You know, the tone in how you're then being passive aggressive to your partner, or layering in some of those other pieces. So verbal obviously tends to be a lot of language-based things, but there are also pieces where things like body language can come into play too, right? So maybe it's not verbal in the sense of auditory, but it is communicating a message, right? So my body language, if I'm you know, taking a stance against my partner that's very intimidating, this is so intimidating, I know, but like if I'm very intimidating, kind of in their face, or even not using my words, so ignoring them, those can kind of fall into that category of verbally abusive behaviors. Let's shift gears to the emotional one. So what might be some examples of some behaviors that we could identify being emotionally abusive behaviors? And I'm going to do the spoiler alert for you. A lot of the things in the verbal category could probably fall into the emotional category as well. But we got some examples in the chat coming in. So tormenting or threatening your partner. So kind of very, very direct or maybe implied threats that are happening of either physical or emotional harm. Gaslighting. Rebecca, I've never heard that term before. That can't be real. What's that? If you care to elaborate on that.
Sure. Gaslighting, when you basically make somebody feel as if they're crazy, but that their feelings, that their experiences are not valid, and yeah, just making them begin to question their own sanity and reality.
Definitely, that is a perfect definition. I think it's gaslighting is a term and a concept that's getting a lot more language to, and this is where I think language can be incredibly helpful for people voicing their experiences. Gaslighting is a term that comes from an actual movie where there were gas lamps, and the abuser, every time they would kind of walk in or out of the room, would turn up or down the light so that their partner would think like, am I losing it? Like, didn't I just change that? Like, why, like, it seems so much darker in here, and made this person kind of question their sense of reality of, am I losing my mind? Which can come in a lot of different forms of, you know, not validating a person's experience. It's connected to sometimes that coercive behavior and that manipulation through that process as well. Yeah, it is that is kind of one of the thoughts on where that term comes from. Jody, you shared microaggression. What does that mean?
So microaggression is one of those terms I think that is used a lot too, where an individual kind of will target you and really it looks subversive almost in a way, that they're trying to emotionally have an impact on you for whatever the reason may be, but it really becomes a very harmful, start to question yourself, start to believe in it, start to shy away from it and pull back, because it can become very emotionally overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And microaggressions oftentimes can be very overt and intentional, but sometimes are also covert and unintentional, right? So if I were to, and this is not how I actually feel, but if I were to say, Jody, that was a really great answer for a woman, like it's so impressive that you could like string those words together in a sentence. That is not how I actually feel.
Chris, I appreciate that. I think to give an example, one thing is similar that I've been told is, you know, you seem a lot more intelligent than you look.
Yes, I get that one a lot. But there, and I think that is also a really good example of how we are talking about these things in the context of abusive relationships, so that interpersonal violence. But a lot of these behaviors, we also see a lot of parallels into other forms of violence and oppression, right? That when we're talking about things like racism, racial gaslighting, racial microaggressions are very real things that happen. When we're talking about forms of, homophobia, the microaggressions of assuming a person's gender and misgendering them, those do come into play and have those parallels between these different forms of harm and abuse as well. Definitely. Let's see, we've also got intentionally or unintentionally making fun of a person in front of them to other people. Tim, you have a question here on how do you see the concept of like kind of triggering kind of playing into this of how something that I might do might trigger someone dealing with or in the healing process. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, yeah. So for instance, if I walk in the room and as a straight white male, I make a comment,
Mhm.
and I may not know anyone else in the room. I may not have any context of where and what's up for other folks in the room. It, someone may have a reaction to that, and then beneath that, they're reacting yet again to something that may be unresolved in their lives. So I don't know. It happens. It happens quite often.
Sure.
To be honest. So I don't know if
Yeah.
people talk or think about that or how to deal with that.
Definitely. And I think triggered is such an interesting concept in our culture right now, where a trigger does stem from, like, the term trigger does stem from like true psychological clinical work, where it is a external stimuli that is causing a response in a person that is triggering that response from them. So in the context of survivordom, we often hear triggers in the sense of if I had a harmful experience from someone who was a smoker, every time that I then smell smoke, I have a trigger response to that, and then subsequently have a trauma response to that trigger. And then kind of in our larger societal context, the how folks are kind of triggered by things, meaning that an action happens and now they're having a response to that sometimes is justifiably like large, because this action that happened triggers something that is either on the basis of gender or race or sexuality, all of those kind of things. Sometimes as human beings, we do things that we don't know are other people's triggers. Sometimes most survivors and victims don't know what their triggers are until they're already triggered by it. In the context of some of the stuff that we're talking about right now, of maybe how do you navigate some of that stuff too. I think on the individual level of your own sense of accountability, just being aware of things that do have the potential for harm, because all of our actions have a potential for harm. Me sharing that example and using Joey as an example when talking about a microaggression had the potential for harm, right? If I didn't contextualize it and kind of say like, these are not, I'm not actually trying to do a microaggression at you. I'm using this as an example. If I didn't say that, that might be maybe have been read incorrectly and triggered a person. So being conscious of our language, of our tone, of our body, and how the impact of what we're doing and saying could have on any individual, regardless of their identity, and being, maybe an extra layer of conscious of when we are having interactions of folks with identities that are different than ours, how those things also might then play out and impact a person, I think is how you kind of navigate and balance some of that stuff on an individual, personal level.
Thank you.
I could spend 3 hours with you all talking more in depth about all of that, but I hope that was kind of a good snippet of a response to your question there.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. For time's sake, we're not going to keep going through these examples, but obviously when we're talking about physical actions, it is any use of your body against another person, or an item or an object against another person, or things that maybe you are not making actual contact. So if I'm, destroying all of my partner's property or punching a hole in the wall, it's less about, I really hate drywall and I just don't want that in my home. And it's more of, look at what I did to this wall. If I did that to that, piece of drywall, imagine what I could do to your face. That there is more of that implied threat there when it is not direct contact, but those behaviors still are physically abusive because there is that intimidation and threat there. And obviously, when we're talking about sexually abusive behaviors, it is, again, any action, whether it's physical, through touch, through intercourse, through contact that is non-consensual. It is any language, so things like catcalling, sexual harassment, those all fall under that umbrella as well of sexually violent behaviors. And there are a lot of different examples that we obviously don't have time for, but every individual who is in a relationship has their own experience of what behaviors are harmful to them, right? So for some people, they are okay with, certain types of physical touch. If my partner pushes me, we have processed how that works for us. But for another person, that might not have that same impact. There is an individual process when it comes to how those behaviors impact a person. It's important to lay out these different categories also to identify how these things might escalate over time. Most abusive relationships don't start with, hey, it's our first date. My name's Chris. I think you're really awesome. Just so you know, I am a physical abuser. I am going to punch you. And matter of fact, here's a quick shove just to show you that I'm real. If that was how every human being acted, they wouldn't be having that second date, right? So oftentimes things don't start with that physical and sexual behaviors that we oftentimes are able to quickly visualize when we're talking about abusive relationships. It often starts with the verbal and emotional, that if I have a sense that I can use my words to create the emotional response that I want from you, that I know that I can control your emotional state and allow myself to feel power from that experience. If I believe that, you are lower than me and I am higher due to power, then I don't see you on the same level of humanity. And if I don't see a person on the same level of humanity, I don't have a problem with then treating them like an object and putting my hands on them. And if I don't have a problem putting my hands on a person, then I can definitely not care about what they're saying when I want sex or I want to feel power from a sexual act against them. And I won't ask for consent because I believe that I am entitled to some of those things. That's how we usually see an escalation of violence in a relationship. That sometimes is very long and drawn out and sometimes can be within like moments. But that is how we can kind of contextualize some of that stuff, that at the root of all forms of violence, there are kind of the cause of why this stuff happens. It is my personal and professional belief that at the root of all forms of violence and harm is power and control. That when we are looking at, anything from domestic and sexual violence to racism, to homophobia, to other forms of harm, at the root of that is the belief that I, as an individual or a group of individuals like me, are deserving and entitled to power over another person or a group of people. And I'm going to use whatever behaviors and tactics to control a person to get that sense of power from them. When we're looking, I think it's important to know that kind of why this stuff happens, because then it helps to say, take a behavior like spitting on a person, right? Pretty harmful, pretty abusive. It's less about, I really want my saliva on your body, and more about, I want to feel like you are less than me, and I'm going to use this behavior to get that sense of power out there. It's important that we understand that why, to kind of contextualize these behaviors and eventually move to that place of prevention. If we can unpack and change how we understand power and control, it's going to change how we understand these behaviors. There are some key concepts that I want you to, and we won't have full time to unpack them, but I want you to walk away thinking about a little bit more in depth of how this shows up. One is confidentiality. Obviously, that is a cornerstone of our work here at Vera House. Think about for yourself and in your interactions with the community, how confidentiality shows up for victims and survivors. I know this because I've worked here for so long that anytime anyone hears you have anything to do with Vera House, they will tell you their entire life story and trauma history. So thinking about how, okay, so you get that information, how can I then provide them with resources and services and make connections for them while also maintaining confidentiality for them? That a lot of folks, maybe they are comfortable sharing it in the moment, but then they don't want it ever mentioned again, or having too many people aware of that, thinking about how that respect for a person's confidentiality and potential anonymity might show up in some of those interactions. Self-determination is another incredibly important cornerstone of the work that we do here at Vera House and in social work kind of in general. Self-determination, as the words kind of imply, is that an individual is determining for themselves what course of action they want to see happen in a situation. So I said that I would share kind of this example of that wanting to fix it, right? We often see this in a lot of times where we're aware of something and we know, like, I know because I've been doing this for a decade, this course of action will be the thing that will generate the most success and reduce the most amount of harm for this person. That is wonderful that I know that. I can't then put that on a person and make that happen. I cannot control them into forcing them to do that thing, because that is denying their sense of self-determination and taking power away from them to make those choices for themselves. Is it annoying? Is it frustrating? Is it scary? Yes. Is it the right thing to do? It is really important, and when we're working with survivors and victims, that we are re-empowering them and providing them with as many options as we can and not answers. You know, what worked for me, what worked for you is fine and lovely and wonderful. Kudos. That might not work for every person. So it's important to keep that in mind as you're kind of interacting with folks, because I think that desire of wanting to fix comes from a really good empathic place, but don't let that get confused with then control issues, right? That I want to fix this doesn't mean I'm going to make everything happen for you. Fixing can also just mean I'm going to provide them with resources and options to help them navigate that and maybe get them some support in the process, but that you can't control whether or not they go back, whether or not they leave, whether or not, you know, all of those things. That is up to the individual to make those informed choices. Trauma informed is another key concept of our work that, you know, we are, I'm sure maybe there's more time to do a more in-depth conversation about trauma informed another time of how that actually looks and how to actually do trauma informed work. That's a whole hour and a half in and of itself. But on a kind of very short, basic level, it is how you are thinking about trauma and how that might impact a person throughout their healing journey and throughout just kind of navigating the world, and being conscious in your communication, in your actions, and how you can reduce triggering a person and bringing that trauma back up to the surface. There's specific language stuff that comes into play there, specific, you know, body language stuff as well. And then the concept of intersectionality is this concept of how we as human beings are all made up of kind of like a snowflake web of different aspects of who we are as a person, that I myself am, you know, a cisgender, queer male, who is adopted, who is mixed, who I don't have a religion, I have interesting thoughts on politics, but how all these layers of my identity are unique to me, and how that impacts how I navigate the world, how people view me, how people treat me, how I work with systems, how systems work with me, how that shows up for me, and that each of you on this call have your own sense of intersectional identities, so they all cross over, and how then the work of domestic and sexual violence does change based on a person's identity. That we do know for a fact our, you know, our cis, straight, white, female clients experience this world of domestic and sexual violence a lot different than folks of other identities. How a queer, disabled, Black, Muslim woman, or man, or trans person experiences domestic and sexual violence, and also then our systems, even here at Vera House, are two different experiences. So that is an intersectional understanding of those things. That's kind of what intersectionality means. Those are really important concepts that I just want to share with you all. And I know that we're coming at time. I'm going to do two things at this point, because I want to give some space for questions. I know I kind of ran through a lot of content really quickly, but I think it's important as board members and foundation members, that you are able to kind of take some of this information and make it applicable and make it kind of real. That is kind of my challenge to you all, because I think as a board you have a lot of power and control in the agency, and those things are very good, right? It's how you use it that makes the difference. But I want you all to kind of take this and think about how you can then apply it to your own kind of lives and understanding. So I did kind of pull together 3 different scenarios to kind of help you think of how you can put this stuff into practice. So I'm not going to assign you homework or anything like that, but I am going to then share back with Jody these 3 scenarios, and I want you to maybe take them, sit with them, think about them, and if you want to talk through what your responses to those things would be, or ask any questions about what would be a good way to handle this, I really encourage that. But do with that what you want to do with that. No homework assignments here, but I'm just going to read them really quickly. But when we're thinking about kind of these what to do things, it's really important to think about what is the problem here, why it's a problem, and what you can do about it. That you're going to have this realistic option for what makes sense for you to do in this situation. And again, just think about it and do what you think about what you would do in that situation. I'm actually not going to read them because we don't have time, but I will share them out. And I want you to kind of just take a look at them at least, and sit with it. Sit with what you realistically would do, and maybe why it might be more helpful or less helpful to think about some of those key concepts that we talked about earlier, in regards to self-determination, in regards to confidentiality, intersectionality, and doing it in a trauma-informed way. But just because I know we are kind of close to time, I'm going to kind of close this out with any questions, comments, concerns folks have when thinking about kind of this overview of domestic and sexual violence.
I have a quick comment. This is such a good, thank you, Chris. You're excellent at all of this. One of the things that I'm glad you talked about, and I always struggle with, is the self-determination part. Is it can be really difficult, especially with somebody close to you that to not want to fix things or not kind of want to pressure them to do certain things. And so that's a really good reminder, and that it's not about fixing people, right? It's about being there in the way that they need you to be there. And sometimes it's in a way different space than you want them to be. So I appreciate you saying that, because that's something I struggle with a fair bit when I'm approached about my friends' concerns or things like that.
Yeah, I think it is a natural thing that a lot of folks kind of have to find that balance for, because when you are aware that things are happening, it is very natural to want to not have that harm to continue. And for many of us who then kind of know the steps that can be helpful, it's very easy to fall into that. And I think that there is not necessarily, harm in wanting to lean in to figuring things out with people, I think being the key difference, not for them, but with them, right? Talking through what some of those options are, and not just saying, here's what you're going to do. You're going to call Vera House. Chris is going to answer, and he's going to, get you the order of the protection, and you're going to leave, and you're going to go into the shelter, and it's all going to be okay, right? Versus, here's what some options for you might be. Vera House does have a hotline. Some of the things that they can help you with are getting an order of protection. We do have this service of shelter that sounds like it might be a helpful thing. Do those things sound like they would be helpful to you? Oh, okay. So you don't actually want to leave. Okay. If that is your choice, what are maybe some things that can help you stay safe in that time? Do you want me to keep checking in with you? Do you want to have a code word for if you do need me to call you or something like that? Thinking through what some of those alternative options are, especially when folks are maybe making choices and decisions that we don't have the same level of agreement around. I do not wish for folks to stay in harmful, abusive relationships, but I know also that a person just up and leaving could increase their risk of harm, right? That those 90 days after a person leaves are sometimes the most dangerous for them and the most high risk. So there are a lot of factors that might dissuade a person from leaving. So again, that self-determination I think is really key and crucial. I think especially for all of you on the board and the foundation, where folks might be interacting with you in different ways. Obviously, you don't work here, so like and unless you want to volunteer, which again, shameless plug, we are always looking for wonderful folks to help in lifting, especially some of our direct service stuff. And you all have an incredible knowledge base and skill set that is just invaluable. But I hear the most from other board members and folks that, you know, it's once you say you're part of Vera House in some regard, like that's when, you know, you get the old friend you never talked to in years reaching out on Facebook of like, oh, this is what happened to me. What do I do? Right. And the what to do is not to just call Randy to fix it. Those kind of things that, you know, we're going to talk through some of those options and not just kind of jump into, because then we get like, oh, no. So yeah, empowering folks is really why we're here. I did share in the chat a link to a evaluation if folks don't mind, if they have the time to just fill that out at some point, and I'll email that out as well if folks don't have the time to right now. That just is really helpful for me to hear what went well in this conversation and what you would have wanted seen differently. I take no qualms. I almost said read me to filth, but that is maybe not a term that everyone's familiar with. Share any feedback that you would like to share. It is always helpful to hear what is good and what is, if you're wanting more, if you're wanting less, that's why we're here.
Thank you, Chris. This has been phenomenal. I really exceeded all expectation for me. And, you know, this will be on the portal. I have recorded it, hopefully. I think I heard it recording. And we'll put it on the portal. So if you know other foundation and board members that weren't able to attend and maybe are touching base to ask about, you know, how it went, refer them to the portal, have them take a peek. You know, Chris, again, is a phenomenal resource. If you'd like to see more, because these sessions that we're doing periodically are usually different topics. If you'd like to do this one again, if you'd like to expand on it, you know, let us know that in the comments you'll share with Chris and the eval he shared, because that would be really helpful to know. But again, I really want to thank you all for being here. We'll stay, it's right 1 o'clock now. Chris, thank you again. And if anyone needs to connect in a different way, because some of this may have been not just informative, but you know, you may feel like you would like to take advantage of some of the services that Vera House has to offer. Again, confidential and otherwise, please don't hesitate to reach out to Chris. And we will be of any help or service that you think you may need always. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Chris. Bye now.
Bye.